August 25th, 1944, 7 kilometers east of Chartres, France. Oberst Heinrich Müller lowered his binoculars with hands that trembled not from fear, but from disbelief. Through the morning mist rising from the French countryside, an impossible sight materialized. American trucks, hundreds of them, stretching beyond the visible horizon in both directions. They moved in perfect convoy discipline, each vehicle exactly 60 meters behind the one ahead, their engines producing a continuous thunder that shook the ground beneath his observation post. Müller had commanded panzer supply columns throughout the Russian campaign. He understood logistics, understood what moving an army required. The convoy before him defied everything German doctrine said was possible. His staff officer, Hauptmann Weber, stood beside him counting vehicles through his own optics. After 15 minutes, Weber stopped counting at 412 trucks, and the column still showed no end. What paralyzed both officers wasn't merely the quantity. German intelligence had warned them about American material superiority. What shattered their understanding was the composition of the convoy. Through high-powered optics, they could see the drivers clearly. The vast majority were black soldiers. In the German military worldview, shaped by years of Nazi racial ideology, this seemed impossible. The Americans were entrusting their critical supply operations, the lifeblood of their advancing armies, to men their own society had relegated to second-class citizenship. Müller drafted his report carefully, knowing Berlin would dismiss it as exaggeration. He wrote exactly what he observed. An endless convoy of 2.5-ton trucks, each loaded far beyond rated capacity, moving at speeds that German supply columns never achieved, driven primarily by Negro soldiers who demonstrated discipline and coordination, exceeding many Wehrmacht units. The convoy moved with mechanical precision, each truck maintaining exact spacing, the entire operation functioning like a single organism rather than thousands of individual vehicles. What neither Müller nor any German intelligence officer understood was that they were witnessing the redballexpress, an operation so ambitious that even American logistics officers had initially declared it impossible. This convoy represented not just American industrial might, but revolution in military logistics that would prove more decisive than any weapon system developed during the war. The crisis that created the redballexpress began with success. Operation Cobra, launched July 25, 1944, shattered German defenses in Normandy. American armor, led by General George Patton's Third Army, exploded the breakthrough with aggression that stunned German commanders. By mid-August, Patton's tanks were racing across France at speeds approaching 50 miles daily, far exceeding any advance rate Allied planners had anticipated. This spectacular success created an equally spectacular problem. Every mile Patton advanced stretched the supply lines another mile longer. Every German position bypass required trucks to drive further to reach the front. Every day of rapid advance consumed fuel and ammunition at rates that made pre-invasion calculations meaningless. The mathematics of modern mechanized warfare were brutal and unforgiving. A single M4 Sherman tank consumed approximately 200 gallons of fuel daily during active operations. Patton's Third Army fielded approximately 400 tanks. Simple multiplication revealed a daily fuel requirement of 80,000 gallons for tanks alone. Add trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, tank destroyers, and other vehicles, and the daily petroleum requirement exceeded 500,000 gallons. Ammunition consumption followed similar patterns. Artillery batteries supporting the advance fired thousands of shells daily. Each 105 millimeters howitzer shell weighed 33 pounds. A single artillery battalion conducting a preparatory barrage might fire 2,000 shells, requiring 33 tons of ammunition delivery. The Third Army fielded dozens of artillery battalions. Beyond fuel and ammunition came food, medical supplies, replacement parts, spare tires, engine oil, communication equipment, and thousands of other items required to keep a modern army functioning. Logistics officers calculated that each American soldier in active combat required approximately 67 pounds of supplies daily. Patton's Third Army numbered approximately 250,000 men, requiring over 8 million pounds of supplies every 24 hours. The original invasion plan assumed a methodical advance, with ports captured and repair providing steady supply flow. The The plan assumed the front line would remain within reasonable distance of Normandy beaches. The plan assumed German resistance would slow American advances to manageable speeds. Reality destroyed these assumptions. Patton's armor reached positions a plan said wouldn't be achieved for months. The ports that should have been operational remained in German hands, or were so thoroughly destroyed that repairs would take weeks. The only functioning supply route stretched from Normandy beaches across hundreds of miles of French roads to wherever Patton happened to be that particular day. By August 15th, the crisis reached critical mass. Patton's tanks, having advanced over 400 miles in 3 weeks, simply stopped. Not because of German resistance, but because they ran out of fuel. The most powerful armored force ever assembled sat motionless on French roads, their crews helpless as their fuel gauges read empty. Behind them, millions of pounds of supplies sat in Normandy dumps, unable to reach the armies that desperately needed them. The conventional truck transportation system had collapsed. Regular supply runs using standard convoy procedures couldn't deliver sufficient tonnage across such distances. The math was simple and devastating. A truck traveling from Normandy to Patton's position required 2 days, 1 day driving to the front, 1 day returning. During those 2 days, the front moved another 100 miles further away. The transportation system was chasing a target that moved faster than the system could operate. German commanders, monitoring American radio traffic, recognized the supply crisis. They understood that if the pause lasted long enough, they could establish new defensive lines, bring up reinforcements, and potentially stabilize the Western Front. Every day Patton remained stationary was a day Germany gained to prepare defenses. Into this crisis stepped Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, commanding the services of supply, and his chief of transportation, Colonel John S. Younger. Both men understood conventional solutions wouldn't work. The problem required something unprecedented, something that violated every standard logistics procedure. The Red Ball Express emerged from desperation and innovation. The name came from railroad terminology, where red ball freight received absolute priority, with all other traffic yielding to its passage. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity and audacity. Dedicate specific roads exclusively to supply convoys. Run those convoys 24 hours daily. Load trucks to maximum capacity, regardless of rated limits. Eliminate all stops except for fuel and critical repairs. Make delivering supplies the only priority, overriding all other considerations. The scale required to make this work was staggering. The Transportation Corps would need to dedicate over 6,000 trucks exclusively to the Red Ball operation. These vehicles would be pulled from every other supply mission, creating shortages elsewhere that would simply have to be accepted. The trucks would require over 23,000 drivers and support personnel, also stripped from other assignments. The operation would consume 2 dedicated highways, one for loaded trucks heading to front, one for empty trucks returning to Normandy. Every road intersection would require military police to ensure no other traffic interfered with Red Ball convoys. Every few miles would need fuel stations prepositioned to service the endless stream of trucks. Mobile maintenance units would need to patrol constantly, repairing breakdowns on the spot to prevent convoy disruption. Most critically, the operation would require drivers capable of operating under conditions that exceeded normal human endurance. Shifts would stretch to 20 hours or more. Drivers would operate on minimal sleep, consuming stimulants to stay alert. They would drive through darkness without headlights to avoid German air attack. They would navigate bomb roads, bypass destroyed bridges, and maintain exact convoy discipline regardless of conditions. Finding over 23,000 soldiers willing and able to operate under these conditions presented challenges that revealed uncomfortable truths about American society. The Transportation Corps consisted largely of units designated as colored in the military's segregated structure. These units existed because American society in 1944 assumed black soldiers were unsuitable for combat, but acceptable for labor and support roles. The prejudice that created these segregated service units inadvertently created exactly what the Red Ball Express required. Thousands of trained truck drivers, organized into functioning units, available for immediate deployment. the 3,595th Quartermaster Truck Company, the 514th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company, and dozens of similar units stood ready. These units consisted of men like Private First Class William Scott, who had driven trucks in civilian life before the draft took him from Georgia to Europe, like Corporal James Harrison, who had worked in Detroit's auto plants and understood vehicles better than most mechanics, like Sergeant Robert Matthews, who had managed a small trucking company in Chicago before the war. These soldiers understood they were serving in a segregated military that denied them opportunities given to white soldiers. They understood their country's contradictions, fighting for democracy abroad while denying it at home. Many had experienced the particular absurdity of training camps in the American South, where German prisoners of war ate in restaurants that refused service to black American soldiers guarding them. Yet, when the call came for the Red Ball Express, these units volunteered knowing the operation would be more dangerous and demanding than anything they had previously experienced. They volunteered because the mission mattered. They volunteered because they saw an opportunity to prove themselves. They volunteered because, despite everything, they believed in the cause they served. The first Red Ball convoy rolled out on August 25th, 1944, the same day Oberst Muller watched in disbelief from his observation post. The route stretched from St. Lo in Normandy through Alsace, Chartres, and ultimately to wherever the front happened to be that day. 2 highways, designated Red Ball routes, received complete dedication to supply operations. Military police established checkpoints at every intersection. White-painted signs reading Red Ball Highway, "Stay off," appeared every few miles. Local French traffic was completely prohibited. Even American military vehicles, not part of the Red Ball system, were required to pull off and wait for convoys to pass. The highways belonged exclusively to the supply trucks. The trucks themselves were primarily GMC CCKW 353 2.5-ton cargo trucks, universally known as deuceandahalf. These vehicles represented American automotive engineering at its practical best. The inline 6-cylinder engine produced 104 horsepower, modest but reliable. The 2-speed transfer case provided enough gear range for highway driving and off-road operation. The 10-tire configuration distributed weight effectively, though those tires would prove a constant challenge. Standard load capacity for a CCKW was 5,000 pounds. Red Ball operations routinely loaded trucks to 8,000 or 9,000 pounds, sometimes exceeding 10,000. This overloading reduced vehicle lifespan dramatically, but increased tonnage delivered per convoy. The calculation was simple. Trucks could be replaced, time could not. Each truck carried a 2-man crew, driver and assistant driver. The assistant's primary role was keeping the driver awake during marathon shifts. They talked constantly, told stories, sang songs, anything to prevent the driver from succumbing to fatigue. When drivers became too exhausted to continue safely, assistant drivers took over, though often they were equally exhausted. The convoys moved in groups of approximately 50 vehicles, maintaining 60-meter spacing. The spacing balanced efficiency with safety. Closer spacing risked chain reaction collisions if one truck stopped suddenly. Greater spacing wasted road capacity. 60 meters proved optimal through trial and error that cost lives learning. Lead vehicles carried experienced drivers who set pace for the entire convoy. Following drivers focused entirely on maintaining exact distance to the truck ahead. This required constant attention because speeds varied with terrain and road conditions. Acceleration and braking had to match the vehicle ahead precisely to maintain formation. At approximately 45 miles per hour average speed, faster than standard military convoys, the mathematics of Red Ball operations took shape. St. Lo to Chartres measured roughly 150 miles, requiring about 3.5 hours of driving. From Chartres to wherever Patton's front happened to be added another 100 to 150 miles. A round trip from Normandy to the front and back exceeded 600 miles, requiring minimum 15 hours of continuous driving under ideal conditions. Conditions were never ideal. Roads damaged by combat required careful navigation. Destroyed bridges necessitated detours, adding dozens of miles. Traffic jams at critical junctions cost hours. Mechanical breakdowns stopped entire convoys until repairs were completed or the damaged vehicle pushed off the road. Weather turned roads to mud or created visibility conditions that slowed convoys to crawling speeds. The drivers developed techniques to manage these marathon shifts. They learned to drink coffee continuously, though the caffeine eventually lost effectiveness. They learned to sing together, the sound carrying from truck to truck down the convoy. They learned to slap their own faces, stick their heads out windows into cold air, anything to maintain alertness. They learned to ignore exhaustion that made hallucinations common. Drivers reported seeing phantom vehicles that weren't there, imagining obstacles that didn't exist, losing track of whether their eyes were open or closed. They learned to trust the truck ahead as a guide, following its taillights through darkness when exhaustion made independent navigation impossible. The physical toll was immediate and severe. After 72 hours of red ball operations, drivers exhibited symptoms similar to combat fatigue. Hands shook uncontrollably. Judgment became impaired. Reaction time slowed dangerously. Medical officers examining red ball drivers reported stress levels comparable to infantry soldiers in active combat. Yet they continued because the mission demanded it. Radio reports on the front made clear what happened when supplies ran short. Patton's tanks sat immobile, vulnerable to German counterattack. Artillery batteries rationed shells, unable to provide promised fire support. Infantry units stretched rations, went hungry when supplies failed to arrive. The red ball drivers understood their cargo meant the difference between advance and stalemate, perhaps between victory and defeat. The first week of operations delivered approximately 89,000 tons of supplies, exceeding even optimistic projections. This tonnage came at tremendous cost. Accidents claimed lives daily. Drivers falling asleep at the wheel crashed into trees, ditches, other vehicles. Trucks overloaded beyond safe limits suffered catastrophic mechanical failures. Tires, pushed beyond endurance, exploded at highway speeds, causing trucks to roll over. German aircraft, though increasingly rare due to Allied air superiority, occasionally attacked red ball convoys. The trucks traveled without escort, without anti-aircraft protection, completely vulnerable. Strafing runs by Focke-Wulf 190s caused devastating damage. A single fighter could destroy or damage dozens of trucks in one pass, killing drivers who had no defense. More insidious than direct attack was German knowledge of red ball routes. Wehrmacht intelligence quickly identified the dedicated supply highways. Artillery units positioned within range of red ball routes received priority targeting assignments. Random harassment fire struck convoys, calculated to disrupt operations without exposing German guns to counter battery fire. Private Scott remembered a night convoy through Chartres when German artillery opened fire. The shells didn't hit his truck directly, but exploded close enough to shower the cab with shrapnel. His assistant driver took metal fragments in the shoulder and face, but insisted on continuing the mission. They drove another 100 miles with the assistant driver bleeding, pressing gauze against his wounds while watching for the next truck's taillights. The physical dangers were constant and unavoidable. The psychological pressures proved equally challenging. Red ball drivers operated in a peculiar isolation despite being surrounded by thousands of comrades. The mission's urgency meant no breaks, no rest periods, no opportunity for normal social interaction. Drivers saw the same faces, their assistant, and perhaps drivers of nearby trucks, for days at a time without other human contact. This isolation was compounded by the segregated nature of their units. While they risked their lives supplying white combat units, they remained separated by official policy. When convoys stopped for fuel or brief rest, drivers ate at separate facilities, used separate latrines, received separate quarters when quarters existed at all. The contradiction created bitter ironies. Sergeant Matthews recalled delivering ammunition to an artillery battery whose white soldiers were openly contemptuous, making racial comments while unloading shells that black drivers had transported 500 miles. He recalled delivering fuel to tank units that expressed surprise that colored boys could handle trucks. He recalled countless small humiliations that accompanied life-saving service. Yet within the Red Ball Express itself, something different emerged. The shared hardship created bonds that transcended the military's official segregation. White military police manning intersection checkpoints developed respect for the black drivers who passed hour after hour, day after day. White maintenance personnel working to keep trucks operational came to appreciate the skill required to drive overloaded vehicles across damaged roads for 20 hours straight. White logistics officers, depending on red ball deliveries, gained understanding of the men who made the impossible routine. This respect didn't eliminate racism or change official policy, but it created cracks in the edifice of segregation. When white and black soldiers shared cigarettes at refueling stations, talked about home while waiting for repairs, worked together to clear a disabled truck from the highway, they glimpsed possibilities that official policy denied. The operational statistics told their own story. By September 15th, after 3 weeks of continuous operations, the Red Ball Express had transported 412,193 tons of supplies. This tonnage, distributed across cargo, translated to approximately 82 million pounds of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment. The numbers represented not abstract statistics, but the difference between armies that could fight and armies that could only defend. Patton's Third Army, resupplied by Red Ball deliveries, resumed its advance. In the first week of September, his armor covered another 150 miles, liberating dozens of French towns and taking thousands of German prisoners. The advance continued because Red Ball trucks kept rolling. The cost of these achievements grew daily. Maintenance reports documented the systematic destruction of the truck fleet. Vehicles rated for 100,000 miles were reaching failure after 20,000. Engines designed for moderate use were running continuously at high RPM, burning out bearings and destroying pistons. Transmissions subjected to constant gear changes without adequate cooling time simply seized. Axles bent under overweight loads. Frames cracked from stress. Tire consumption exceeded all projections. A standard CCKW tire, properly maintained and moderately used, might last 20,000 miles. Under red ball conditions, 5,000 miles was exceptional. Overloading, high speeds, and damaged roads destroyed tires at rates that strained even American industrial production. Convoys sometimes left trails of shredded rubber marking their passage. The Transportation Corps established tire depots every 50 miles along red ball routes. Crews worked around the clock replacing blown tires, often changing 20 or 30 per shift. They learned to work with desperate speed because every minute a truck sat disabled was a minute not delivering cargo. They developed techniques to change all 10 tires on a CCKW in under 20 minutes, a pace that would have seemed impossible before the war. Fuel consumption followed similar patterns. Each red ball truck consumed approximately 12 gallons per 100 miles. With convoys running 600-mile round trips, each vehicle required roughly 72 gallons daily. 6,000 trucks demanded over 430,000 gallons just to fuel the supply operation. Fuel that had to be transported before it could transport other supplies. The circular logistics created mathematics that seemed to approach impossibility, yet somehow worked. The human cost proved harder to quantify, but ultimately more significant. The Transportation Corps maintained incomplete records of casualties, partly due to bureaucratic inefficiency, but also due to systemic racism that undervalued black soldier service. The official records that exist document 231 deaths directly attributed to red ball operations during its 83 days of primary service. The real number certainly exceeded this figure. These deaths came from accidents, exhaustion, German attacks, and the simple accumulated stress of impossible duty. Corporal James Harrison died when his truck, traveling at night without lights to avoid German aircraft, struck a bomb crater and rolled into a ravine. Private William Scott survived the war, but carried shrapnel wounds for the rest of his life from that German artillery strike near Chartres. Sergeant Robert Matthews developed a heart condition attributed to the sustained stress of red ball operations, dying in 1952 at age 41. Beyond deaths and physical injuries came psychological casualties that received no official recognition. Combat fatigue, later recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected red ball drivers at rates comparable to infantry soldiers. The constant danger, the relentless exhaustion, the isolation, and the weight of knowing that others depended on their performance created trauma that many carried for decades. The military's medical establishment, still primitive in its understanding of psychological stress, had no framework for recognizing non-combat trauma. Red Ball drivers suffering from anxiety, depression, or stress-related disorders received no treatment, no recognition, no support. They were expected to simply continue driving, continue functioning, continue sacrificing regardless of personal cost. Yet they did continue. Through September 1944, as Allied armies advanced toward the German border, the Red Ball Express maintained its relentless pace. The daily rhythm became routine despite remaining extraordinary. Dawn brought fresh convoys rolling out of Normandy supply dumps, trucks loaded until their suspension sagged. Midday saw these same trucks fighting through traffic at critical junctions, passing slower vehicles, maintaining formation discipline. Evening brought arrivals at forward supply points where tired quartermasters worked frantically to unload cargo before trucks began their return journey. Midnight saw empty convoys rolling back toward Normandy to load again. This rhythm continued without pause, without rest days, without acknowledgement that what they were doing exceeded reasonable human limits. The Transportation Corps calculated that it needed 6,000 trucks to maintain required supply flow. They had exactly 6,000 trucks dedicated to Red Ball. There was no reserve, no backup, no margin for error. Every truck had to operate continuously or the system would fail. The drivers understood this mathematics, even if they didn't speak of it explicitly. They understood that their exhaustion, their pain, their injuries were subordinate to the mission. They understood that taking a day off meant supplies wouldn't reach soldiers who needed them. They understood that their service, though unrecognized by the broader military and ignored by American society, meant everything to the war's outcome. This understanding created a pride that transcended the racism they encountered. When white soldiers made dismissive comments, Red Ball drivers could point to the supplies they delivered. When society back home treated them as second-class citizens, they knew they were performing first-class service. When official policy relegated them to support roles, they understood that support made victory possible. The operation scale became clear through comparison with German logistics. Wehrmacht's applied doctrine, developed through years of European warfare, emphasized local requisitions supplemented by rail transport. German armies advancing through occupied territory were expected to feed themselves largely from local resources, with railroads bringing forward ammunition and fuel. This system worked reasonably well during Germany's early conquest of Poland, France, and the Low Countries, where intact rail networks and relatively short distances allowed adequate supply flow. It began showing strain during the invasion of the Soviet Union, where vast distances and Soviet scorched-earth tactics created supply problems Germany never fully solved. By 1944, with Allied air superiority, destroying rail lines faster than Germany could repair them, Wehrmacht logistics had essentially collapsed. German units at the front received only a fraction of the supplies they required. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks. Ammunition shortages forced artillery rationing. Food shortages reduced soldiers to near-starvation rations. The contrast with American logistics was stark and undeniable. While German units scrambled for basic supplies, American forces enjoyed abundance. While German armor sat immobile for lack of fuel, American tanks advanced continuously. While German artillery conserved ammunition, American batteries fired thousands of shells daily. The Red Ball Express created this disparity, turning American industrial might into battlefield superiority. German commanders recognized this reality even as they remained powerless to counter it. Captured documents from September 1944 reveal Wehrmacht officers' obsession with American supply operations. One intelligence report stated, "The enemy's logistical capabilities exceed our most pessimistic estimates. They move supplies at volumes and speeds we cannot match. Our forces cannot win battles against enemies who possess unlimited ammunition and fuel while we ration every shell and gallon." General Maurice Coltitz, commanding German forces in Paris, surrendered partly because he recognized the impossibility of defense without supplies. His units possessed adequate weapons and ammunition for perhaps 2 days of serious fighting. American forces approaching Paris could sustain combat indefinitely. The mathematics of logistics made military resistance pointless. Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, reported to Berlin that American supply capabilities represented Germany's most serious disadvantage. He wrote, "We can win tactical engagements through superior training and defensive positions. We cannot win campaigns against enemies whose logistics allow sustained offensive operations regardless of losses. Every day we destroy American equipment. Replacement equipment arrives within days. Our losses are permanent. Theirs are temporary." This recognition drove German strategy in autumn 1944. Unable to match American logistics, Wehrmacht forces focused on defending positions that might disrupt supply lines. They fortified port cities, knowing captured ports would ease American supply problems. They defended river crossings, knowing bridges were critical supply route choke points. They established positions within artillery range of major highways, hoping to disrupt convoy operations. These efforts achieved limited tactical success, but couldn't overcome strategic reality. Even when German artillery destroyed red ball trucks or damaged highways, American engineering units repaired damage within hours. Even when German forces held ports, the Red Ball Express simply drove supplies overland. Even when German aircraft successfully attacked convoys, replacement trucks and drivers arrived to maintain operations. The Red Ball Express represented American advantages that Germany couldn't counter through military means. The industrial capacity to produce 6,000 trucks for a single supply operation, the petroleum production to fuel those trucks continuously, the tire production to replace thousands of tires weekly, the training infrastructure to prepare tens of thousands of drivers, the organizational sophistication to coordinate such complex operations, the societal wealth that allowed dedicating such resources to logistics rather than direct combat. Perhaps most importantly, the Red Ball represented democratic mobilization that totalitarian systems couldn't replicate. The drivers who made the operation succeed were there voluntarily, motivated by patriotism despite facing discrimination. They performed extraordinary service because they believed in the cause, not because terror forced compliance. This voluntary commitment generated performance that coercion never could match. The contrast with German forced labor illustrated this principle. Germany increasingly relied on slave labor from conquered territories to maintain military production and logistics. These workers, operating under threat of death, performed minimally and sabotaged whenever possible. Quality of German equipment actually declined as forced labor replaced skilled German workers sent to combat. American logistics, even when performed by soldiers facing racism, benefited from genuine commitment. Red Ball drivers took pride in their service, maintained their vehicles carefully, pushed themselves to extremes voluntarily. This difference between coerced labor and committed service proved decisive in countless small ways that accumulated into strategic advantage. By late September 1944, the Red Ball Express had achieved its primary objective. Patton's Third Army, fully supplied and mobile again, had advanced to the German border. British forces in the north, also benefiting from Red Ball deliveries, reached the Netherlands. Allied forces stood poised to enter Germany itself, a position that seemed impossible in mid-August when supply shortages threatened to stall the entire advance. The operation had transported over 412,000 tons of supplies across an average distance of over 400 miles. The tonnage broke down approximately into 120,000 tons of fuel, 90,000 tons of ammunition, 80,000 tons of rations, and 120,000 tons of other supplies, including medical equipment, spare parts, and engineering materials. These supplies enabled the liberation of Paris, the freeing of dozens of French towns and villages, the capture of over 100,000 German prisoners, and the advance of Allied lines from Normandy to the German frontier. The Red Ball Express didn't win battles directly, but made winning battles possible. The human cost of these achievements remained largely unrecognized. The Transportation Corps soldiers who made Red Ball succeed received few decorations, little recognition, and no special honors. Their service was categorized as support rather than combat, making them ineligible for many awards. The segregated nature of their units meant their achievements were rarely publicized to American audiences. When newspapers back home covered the war's progress, they showed photographs of white infantry and armor units. When magazines profiled American heroes, they interviewed white combat soldiers. When the military issued commendations, they went disproportionately to white units regardless of actual accomplishments. The systemic racism that relegated black soldiers to support roles also ensured their contributions remain invisible. This invisibility had consequences extending far beyond individual recognition. American society, consuming wartime media, developed understanding of the war that excluded black Americans' contributions. The narrative of victory emphasized white soldiers' combat prowess while ignoring logistics that made combat possible. This selective memory would influence post-war race relations and the civil rights struggles that followed. Yet within the military itself, changes were occurring that would eventually force broader social recognition. White officers commanding red ball operations couldn't ignore their drivers' competence. White logistics personnel, depending on supply deliveries, couldn't dismiss the men who made deliveries possible. White combat soldiers receiving ammunition and fuel in desperate situations couldn't forget who transported those supplies through danger. General Eisenhower, commanding all Allied forces in Europe, received regular reports on red ball operations. These reports made clear that black transportation corps units were performing at levels exceeding many white units. Eisenhower, though not immune to his era's prejudices, recognized competence when documented so thoroughly. This recognition influenced his post-war testimony before Congress regarding military integration. He stated that logistics operations, particularly the Red Ball Express, had demonstrated that black soldiers could perform any military task at the highest levels when given opportunity. While Eisenhower didn't advocate immediate integration, his acknowledgement of black soldiers' capabilities carried weight that would influence later integration decisions. General Patton, whose Third Army depended entirely on red ball deliveries, made similar observations. Despite his personal racism, widely documented and often expressed crudely, he recognized that black drivers were keeping his army mobile. In a September 1944 letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The colored truck drivers are performing miracles. They drive longer hours and carry heavier loads than I would have thought possible. My tanks roll because these men refuse to stop driving." Such recognition, however grudging or partial, represented progress in military thinking that would eventually influence broader society. When respected commanders acknowledged black soldiers' competence, it challenged assumptions underlying segregation. When performance records documented black units' achievements, it contradicted propaganda about racial inferiority. The Red Ball Express officially ended November 16, 1944, after 83 days of continuous operations. By this date, Allied forces had captured ports including Antwerp, enabling more efficient supply distribution. The crisis that created Red Ball had passed, though the transportation infrastructure it built remained valuable. Final statistics documented an achievement unprecedented in military logistics. 6,140 trucks had transported 412,193 tons of supplies across cumulative distances, exceeding 32 million miles. This represented more tonnage moved over longer distances in shorter time than any previous military logistics operation in human history. The costs included approximately 1,000 trucks destroyed or damaged beyond repair, 231 confirmed deaths, and over 1,000 serious injuries. These figures, compiled from incomplete records, certainly understate actual casualties. Many accidents went unreported, many injuries untreated, many deaths attributed to other causes. The drivers who survived Red Ball operations returned to segregated society that denied them opportunities given to white veterans. The GI Bill, which provided education and housing benefits to returning soldiers, was administered by local officials who often denied benefits to black veterans. Banks refused mortgages, universities refused admission, employers refused jobs, all based solely on race. Corporal Matthews, who had managed a Chicago trucking company before the war and had driven red ball trucks for 83 days straight, returned home unable to get hired by white-owned trucking firms. He eventually established a small independent trucking business, serving Chicago's black community, never achieving the success his abilities warranted in an unbiased economy. Private Scott returned to Georgia, where segregation remained as rigid as when he left. Despite his military service and demonstrated competence driving trucks across Europe under combat conditions, he found employment options limited to manual labor. He worked in a warehouse until his health failed in the 1960s, receiving no recognition for his wartime service, until a local newspaper reporter discovered his story shortly before his death. Sergeant Harrison was among the lucky ones. He returned to Detroit's auto plants, where United Auto Workers Union protection provided some barrier against discrimination. He worked for 30 years building trucks, similar to those he had driven in France, retiring with a modest pension. He rarely spoke of his Red Ball service, finding that white co-workers showed little interest in black veterans' experiences. These men and thousands like them received no ticker tape parades, no monuments, no national recognition. Their service remained footnotes in histories that emphasized combat operations over the logistics that made combat possible. The narrative of World War II victory centered on dramatic battles and heroic soldiers, not the truck drivers who kept those soldiers supplied. This historical neglect began changing only decades later, as historians examining wartime logistics recognized Red Ball's significance. Academic studies in the 1970s and 1980s documented the operation's scale and importance. Veterans organizations began collecting oral histories from surviving Red Ball drivers. Slowly, recognition emerged that this largely forgotten logistics operation had been crucial to Allied victory in Europe. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps now teaches redballexpress as a case study in effective logistics under extreme conditions. The operations lessons, both successful techniques and costly mistakes, inform modern military logistics doctrine. The principle of dedicated supply routes, proven effective by Red Ball, appears in current operations worldwide. Modern military logistics bears Red Ball's imprint in countless ways. The concept of continuous supply flow rather than periodic resupply comes from Red Ball experience. The practice of overloading vehicles temporarily during crisis operations traces to Red Ball necessity. The understanding that logistics personnel face stress comparable to combat soldiers emerged from Red Ball casualties. Perhaps most significantly, Red Ball's success helped demonstrate that racial integration could enhance rather than harm military effectiveness. The documented competence of black transportation corps units provided evidence used decades later by civil rights advocates arguing for complete military integration. President Truman's 1948 executive order integrating the armed forces cited wartime experience, including logistics operations, as proof that integration would strengthen American military capability. The social impact of Red Ball operations extended beyond military integration to influence broader civil rights movements. Veterans who had driven Red Ball trucks returned home unwilling to accept segregation after proving themselves in service of their country. Their wartime experience, demonstrating competence under conditions white soldiers couldn't match, gave them confidence to demand equal treatment. The Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks in 1955, included several Red Ball veterans among its organizers. These men had driven trucks 500 miles through combat zones, but were required to sit at the back of city buses in Alabama. The contradiction fueled their determination to challenge segregation through nonviolent resistance. The March on Washington in 1963 included Red Ball veterans marching beside Martin Luther King Jr. Their presence symbolized a disconnect between wartime service and peacetime discrimination. Signs carried by veteran marchers asked why men who had served their country in war were denied rights in peace. Their questions had no good answers, helping shift public opinion towards civil rights legislation. The broader story of Red Ball Express illustrates themes extending beyond individual accomplishment to reveal truths about democracy, sacrifice, and recognition. It demonstrates that democratic societies, despite their flaws and contradictions, can mobilize citizens to achieve extraordinary results when existential threats demand united effort. It proves that competence and commitment transcend racial categories. That capability depends on opportunity rather than biology. It also reveals democracy's failure to match wartime ideals with peacetime behavior. The same nation that relied on black soldiers' service in war denied those soldiers basic rights in peace. The same military that recognized black units' competence in logistics maintained segregation in combat roles. The same society that celebrated victory ignored the contributions of those who made victory possible. These contradictions created pressure that eventually forced change, but change came slowly and incompletely. The veterans who drove Red Ball trucks fought another war after returning home, a war for civil rights that would continue for decades. Some lived to see genuine progress toward equality. Others died before America began fulfilling its promise of equal justice. The military logistics revolution started by Red Ball continues evolving. Modern armies move supplies using principles developed during those 83 days in 1944. The understanding that logistics determines campaign success more surely than tactical brilliance comes from operations like Red Ball. The recognition that support personnel face dangers comparable to combat soldiers emerges from Red Ball casualties. Today's military logistics systems achieve efficiency that would seem magical to Red Ball drivers. GPS navigation eliminates route-finding challenges. Computerized tracking monitors every supply item's location continuously. Automated systems predict supply needs before shortages occur. Modern trucks operate for hundreds of thousands of miles without the catastrophic failures that plague Red Ball vehicles. Yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Armies require supplies. Moving supplies requires vehicles. Vehicles require drivers. And drivers require commitment to perform under pressure. The technology advances, but human dedication remains central to success. The Red Ball Express succeeded ultimately not because of American industrial capacity, though that capacity was essential, not because of superior trucks, though those trucks performed remarkably, not because of brilliant logistics planning, though the planning showed genuine innovation. The operation succeeded because 23,000 soldiers, mostly black men facing discrimination, chose to perform impossible duty with extraordinary commitment. They drove when exhaustion made continuing seem impossible. They maintained formation when every instinct urged rest. They pushed overloaded trucks across damaged roads through darkness without lights. They continued driving after friends died in accidents, after German attacks, after their bodies screamed for rest. They did this not because force compelled them, but because they believed their service mattered. This voluntary commitment, this dedication despite facing injustice, represents democratic strength that authoritarian systems cannot replicate. Soldiers fighting because they choose to fight perform at levels coerced soldiers cannot match. This principle, proven by Red Ball Express, helps explain why democratic nations often prevail against seemingly superior authoritarian enemies. Oberst Muller, watching that endless convoy east of Chartres, witnessed this principle in action without fully understanding what he saw. He recognized American material superiority, documented American organizational capability, noted the convoy's operational efficiency. What he couldn't grasp was the human commitment driving those trucks, the voluntary dedication that made the entire system function. German logistics depended increasingly on forced labor by 1944, on conquered peoples compelled to service at gunpoint. This coerced labor performed minimally, sabotaged when possible, never volunteered extra effort. The contrast with Red Ball drivers who pushed themselves to exhaustion voluntarily explained more about the war's outcome than any material comparison. The story of Red Ball Express is ultimately the story of democracy proving itself through crisis. It's the story of a nation finding strength in diversity despite failing to treat all citizens equally. It's the story of individuals choosing to serve causes larger than themselves despite having legitimate grievances. It's a story of ordinary people achieving extraordinary results through commitment rather than coercion. And it's a story that should be remembered, taught, and honored alongside more famous wartime achievements. The drivers who kept Allied armies supplied through those 83 days in 1944 deserve recognition equal to any combat heroes. Their service, though less dramatic than battle, proved equally essential to victory. Their courage, though less visible than combat bravery, was no less real. When we remember World War II victory, we should remember not just the soldiers who fired weapons, but the drivers who delivered the ammunition, not just the generals who planned campaigns, but the logistics officers who made those campaigns possible, not just the white Americans who fought, but the black Americans whose service was equally vital despite facing discrimination. The Red Ball Express stands as testament to what Americans can achieve when united by common purpose. It stands as a reminder of what democracy demands from citizens and what citizens deserve from democracy. It stands as evidence that the greatest victories often come from unsung heroes whose contributions history initially overlooks. Private Scott Corporal Harrison, Sergeant Matthews, and thousands like them drove trucks across France in 1944. In doing so, they helped win a war, challenge racist assumptions, and demonstrate that service and sacrifice are colorblind. Their story deserves to be told, remembered, and honored. This essay attempts at telling, that remembering, that honoring. The Red Ball Express saved Europe's liberation. The men who drove those trucks deserve their place in history's memory alongside any heroes we celebrate.